The Libyan Arab Republic is an enigma to most of the world. One of the leading producers of petroleum since the early 60s, Libya has only 2.5 million people clustered along the narrow coastal strip facing the Mediterranean Sea, backing on vast deserts with a scattering of oases and much of the country's oil wealth. Tripoli, the Libyan capital, with 500,000 inhabitants, presents the most modern face of Libya, along with Benghazi, the other large city on the coast. But even in Tripoli, modernity lives side by side with tradition. And Libya today, under President Muammar Gaddafi's 7-year-old revolutionary rule, seeks its place in the modern world while keeping strictly within the traditions of Islam. On November 14, the First Lady of the Philippines and Governor of Metropolitan Manila, IMELDA Marcos, arrived in Tripoli at the head of a diplomatic and economic mission on what proved to be the most sensitive thus far of her many signal travels as a personal representative of President Marcos. As with China 2 years ago, she came to a country with which the Philippines had no diplomatic relations, with which, in fact, the Philippines had a problem. But she came at the invitation of President Gaddafi himself, who sent his wife, Sofia, to welcome Mrs. Marcos on her arrival, along with the Libyan Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Ali Al-Treki, and the Minister of Labor, Abdul Ati Obeidi. Mrs. Marcos was the first woman dignitary ever to be received officially by Libya's revolutionary government. In a statement issued to the press on her arrival, Mrs. Marcos said that the geographical distance between Manila and Tripoli was obliterated by similarities in the histories of Libya and the Philippines, and by the common ideals that the two countries shared in the Third World. From the airport, Mrs. Marcos and her delegation were taken to the seaside hospitality palace, the former residence of the Crown Prince in the deposed monarchy, now the official guest house for visiting heads of state. Mrs. Gaddafi told Mrs. Marcos that she would be the first woman to occupy the official suites. The Philippine delegation included 3 cabinet members, 4 ambassadors, 4 generals, and the 2 Mindanao regional commissioners. Later, Ministers Al-Treki and Obeidi joined Mrs. Marcos and her delegation at lunch. It was Al-Treki who had first conveyed President Gaddafi's invitation to President Marcos when he came to the Philippines last August on a survey of Mindanao for the Islamic Conference. In the afternoon, Mrs. Gaddafi fetched Mrs. Marcos for a visit to the General People's Congress, Libya's supreme political authority. Tripoli was festive during the week of Mrs. Marcos's visit, which coincided with the second session of the Congress, first convened only last year. Sunday was the first day of the week-long session presided over by President Gaddafi himself. To the Filipinos, the session strongly resembled the recent Batasang Bayan convened by President Marcos. The 980-member Congress is composed of Mr. Gaddafi's all-powerful Revolutionary Command Council, members of his cabinet, and representatives of the Basic People's Congresses, the Libyan counterpart to the Philippines' Sangguniang Bayan. Much of the afternoon discussion centered on the implementation of development programs in the countryside. When the Congress called a recess at 6 p.m., Mrs. Marcos was escorted to the office wing of the building for a meeting with Prime Minister Abdusalam Ahmed Jalloud, Gaddafi's #2 man, who has handled all of the revolutionary government's important negotiations, including arms and oil agreements with Moscow, the talks that led to the expulsion of British and American bases from Libya, and the discussions that led to the nationalization of oil. Mrs. Marcos presented the members of her delegation to the 32-year-old premier. Then they sat down to a 2-hour conversation that originally had been expected to last only 15 minutes. The First Lady explained the Philippine government's policy and development program in southern Philippines and provided Prime Minister Jalud with a backgrounder on the so-called Moro National Liberation Front, which has had its headquarters in Tripoli since June this year. In the evening, Mrs. Marcos was honored at dinner by Foreign Minister Al-Treki, who had invited Libya's diplomatic corps to meet the Philippine guest. The diplomat's wives said it was the first time in 5 years that they had been invited to a state occasion. Mrs. Marcos again spoke of the Muslim Filipinos in her brief remarks after dinner.
My visit to this country is a mission of friendship and goodwill. Our two countries share many parallels in our respective histories, and today we are pushing ahead our common struggle to emerge from the dark hours of colonialism. We are linked by our common adherence to the principles, ideals, and goals of the third world. One indissoluble bond between us is what the Philippines shares in your priceless Islamic heritage and culture. To our own almost 2 million Filipino Muslim population of our 42.5 million Filipinos, President Marcos and the Filipino people are reported to do everything possible to preserve and protect the Islamic tradition of our Filipino Muslims.
The following day, Mrs. Marcos was taken on a tour of various development projects within the city and to an archaeological site. First stop was El Fateh University, its name commemorating the date when Gaddafi and his fellow army officers overthrew the Western imposed monarchy of King Idris in 1969. El Fateh is one of 2 universities in Libya. Established in 1969, it offers courses in medicine, sciences, and teaching, while the university at Benghazi offers the non-scientific courses. Mrs. Marcos also visited an agricultural experiment station where she was told about desert irrigation schemes and cattle breeding. Only 2% of Libya's 600,000 square miles is arable, and Libya has to import more than half of its food requirements. Mrs. Marcos then visited a park zoo and was fascinated by the gazelles. Later, Mrs. Gaddafi gave her a pair of gazelles to take home to Manila. Mrs. Marcos spent 1.5 hours touring a maternity and children's hospital, one of 61 such hospitals that have been built